So yesterday was Christopher Columbus Day. Some people call this day as Indigenous Peoples Day, October 13. However you want to recognize this day as is up to you. But regardless, you cannot talk about Christopher Columbus or the discovery of America without talking about Arabs and how Arabs' misuse of Islam led to the discovery of America. When the Constitution was being drafted, the debate about Muslims being president was actually being debated. And I think that the founding fathers would be horrified to see how there are American cities being overtaken by Arabs who, through Islam, want to conquer the West, conquer America, and destroy America. Now, that conversation is going to be had in a different video, but in this video, we're strictly going to talk about Columbus and how Islam had a huge impact in Europe and amongst Europeans. I'll be reading from this article, which is on my Discord, but if you want to find it yourself, it's under hub.com. Okay, so how the specter of Islam fueled European colonization in the Americas. So let's get to it. As every school child learns, Columbus set sail with India on his mind's horizon. Rarely, though, do school children learn why Columbus sought to cross the Atlantic. Hoping for an alliance with the Grand Khan of the East, he aimed to retake Jerusalem and destroy Islam. His voyages promised an end run around the trade monopolies of the Ottomans and the Mamluks. So Mamluks were Islamic soldiers. And when Columbus arrived in the Americas, fresh from the battle which marked Spain's final defeat of the Muslim kingdom of Granada, he saw, or more accurately, imagined Muslims everywhere. Something that the British also did. Now, let's continue reading. Spanish conquistadors would claim to see mosques in Mexico, American Indians wearing Moorish clothing and performing Moorish dances, Turks invading New Spain from the Pacific, and West African slaves attempting to convert America's indigenous peoples to Islam. This article does not talk about how Christopher Columbus used the writings of Marco Polo, which did talk about the Grand Khan of the East. However, by the time that Christopher Columbus was ready to set sail, the Mongol Empire had already fallen to the Chinese in 1368 under the Ming Dynasty. So by the time he was ready to go set sail, the Mongols were no longer in power. On either side of the unambiguous watershed represented by the year 1492, Islam endured as Europe's primary obsession, its perennial rival and major cultural other, a spur of innovative historical change as well as an enemy on the battlefield. Throughout the 17th century and into the 18th, Europe remained far more concerned about the Ottomans and Islam than about the lands across the Atlantic. Remarkable, in fact, is the apparent lack of interest in the Americas among most Europeans. Charles V, for example, the leader most responsible for his empire's enormous expansion in the New World, uttered not a word about the Americas in his memoir. Him were the Ottoman advances in Europe and his fears about the growing weakness of Christianity vis-a-vis Islam. 16th century France produced twice as many books about Islam as it did about the Americas and Africa combined. Overall, between 1480 and 1609, Europe published 4 times more works about the Muslim world than about the Americas. This disparity only increased over the course of the 17th century. Following the lead of their Spanish predecessors in the New World, the British, a century later, initially understood American Indians through their own history of encounters with Muslims in Europe and the Mediterranean. Before it ever set sail across the Atlantic, that quintessential symbol of British arrival in North America, the Mayflower, had begun its seafaring life trading with Muslims in the Mediterranean. And before he crossed the Atlantic, John Smith, the founder of Jamestown in 1607, spent several swashbuckling years helping to beat back the Ottomans in Hungary and Wallachia, now part of Romania. The Ottomans captured him in 1602 and held him enslaved for 2 years before he managed to escape. But they love to talk about white supremacy, huh? Later, when he became Admiral of New England, Smith named 3 islands across from Cape Cod the 3 Turks' Heads, and he dubbed what is today Cape Ann, Cape Tragabigzanda, after a young woman with whom he had fallen in love while serving her family as a slave. I am going to skip a little bit of this article, and you can read more about John Smith and his connection to the Ottomans as well as other British people, but I'm going to start right here. Although one might assume they would have known better, these Britons repeated Spanish assertions from a century earlier about Muslim connections from the Atlantic. For example, again, that Native American dancing somehow had roots in Old World Muslim dances. They also filtered their understanding of the New World through their earlier personal experiences. Strachey drew parallels between Indian deerskin leggings and the fashion of the Turks. Smith wrote, "If any great commander arrive at the habitation of a Werowance chief, they spread a mat as the Turks do a carpet for him to sit upon." The Ottoman Empire affected the English colonization of America in other ways as well. In the 17th century, many of the thousands of English Protestants who crossed the ocean would cite 2 evils as the reasons for their flight: the injustices and discrimination of their Catholic coreligionists and the scourge of the Muslim Ottomans. Coreligionist means persons of the same religion, by the way. In 1621, for instance, Robert Cushman, a passenger on the Mayflower, wrote of the promise of America as a refuge from an old world then in the grip of the Protestant Catholic 30 Years' War. "If it should please God to punish his people in the Christian countries of Europe for their coldness, carnality, wanton abuse of the gospel, contention, and either by Turkish slavery or by popish tyranny, which God forbid, here is a way opened for such as have wings to fly into this wilderness." As Luther had done at the very start of the Protestant Reformation, Cushman here speaks simultaneously of 2 enemies, Pope and Sultan. Persecuted by papal tiara and sultanic turban, he saw America as his salvation from both. I'm skipping a little bit, but it says, "Indeed, by the end of the 17th century, there were more enslaved Englishmen in North Africa than free ones in North America. Conquerors in Virginia, they were slaves in Algiers," as the scholar Nabil Matar nicely summarizes. Now, this part of the article is very interesting because it says, in 1699, the infamous Puritan minister Cotton Mather bemoaned the fate of those prospective New England settlers taken into North African slavery. "God hath given up several of our sons into the hands of the fierce monsters of Africa. Mahometan, Turks, and Moors, and devils are at this day oppressing many of our sons with slavery, wherein they wish for death and cannot find it." Mather, a slaveholder himself, thus drew a direct line between the English colonial project he represented in America and the Muslims of the Mediterranean. At the same time that he attacked North African slavery, he expressed no qualms about and, in fact, encouraged the American and English enslavement of African Muslims and non-Muslims. I can continue reading because this article is so fascinating, but I will leave it at that. Now, it's very interesting to note that Arabs, Saudi Arabia did not end slavery until 1962. And who forced them to end slavery? The West, okay? And it was also documented that they were enslaving African children well into the 1980s. But will they talk about Arab supremacy? No.